Hello, I'm Carola Suárez-Orozco, Director of the Immigration Initiative at Harvard, and I'm delighted to have a conversation today with Dr. María Hernández, Deputy Executive Director of School Change and Community Engagement and the Co-Director of Innovations and Equity at the Metro Center at NYU. So Maria, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Can you share with us a little bit about your family's moving story?
Yes, thank you so much for having me so I could have a conversation with you. I'm truly honored. My family's immigration story really starts with my mother coming to the United States initially when I was one. I was actually left with my father and the paternal side of the family. She came, lived in the United States for about 3 years, and then returned to El Salvador. At that point, my parents separated, and as there were rumors around a potential war starting in El Salvador, specifically the shifts in political power, but really the instability of the country. At that point, my mother made a choice to say, we're leaving El Salvador to immigrate to the United States undocumented. So as we came to the United States, I grew up in LA.
So you were about 4 at that time?
I was 6.
You were 6, so a couple years went by.
Yeah, I was 6 when I first arrived in LA. From there, existed in LA for various years as I moved through an educational system, and at the same time, a lot of my family still remained in El Salvador, except for my mother and I.
So you didn't have much of a family network in the Los Angeles area at the time?
No, did not have a family network. What we did have is the first time around when my mother came to the United States, she did come to LA, and one of her friends from El Salvador had first immigrated, and then she went back to El Salvador. But part of that, she found a network of friends. So that friend, when we first got here, she called that friend, and we lived with them for a small period of time. So she had some relationships, and we were able to navigate through those few relationships. But in terms of more biological family, there was no one at that point here.
So it was more fictive kin in many ways.
Yes, absolutely. And I call what I refer to now extended family.
Right. Which are so important in the process of adapting and integrating in a new space.
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear a little bit about what your experience was like in K through 12 schools. Had you gone to school at all in El Salvador before coming, or did you enter the school system here?
I had gone to El Salvador. I completed kindergarten.
All right.
So
you'd begun to learn to read in Spanish there.
So I've gotten some basic literacy concepts at that point, knowing your alphabet and kind of being able to begin to combine words that had meaning, right? At that point, I was doing a little bit of reading, I would say. So as I came to enter schools here, the school I went to was down the street from where we actually lived. NLA, and part of that continuum really started with my first grade teacher. So when I got here, I was placed into English as a second language classroom, and then in second grade. So I'm a product of the Los Angeles Unified School District, and an effort at that point of LAUSD was to actually deseg schools, and so students of color, specifically black and brown students, were sent out to the Valley, which at that point was mostly white, to get quote unquote a better schooling there. So since the second grade, I was bused out to the Valley, where I went through elementary school. It was at that point, elementary school was K to 6. And so K to 6 and starting there in second grade, I think there's certain things that I clearly remembered around being othered. Very early on, I experienced really being othered.
Can you give some examples?
First, it was around language. Some of the comments that my teachers would say about you need to learn English. You're now in the United States. Furthermore,
so no more English, no more ESL supports at this point.
Well, I was still receiving ESL supports.
Right. Okay.
But the message was still around.
You best learn English quickly.
Yeah, and my language and what I was bringing alongside with me was not valuable. And in that context, I quickly realized that I'm not welcomed here, and I'm not really wanted in this space. And I always tell this story because it was very telling for me, because I still remember it, because I'm also thinking about the ways and the assumptions they made about my mother being a single parent as well, being a single parent that made less than $10,000 a year, and how that narrative really kind of funneled the ways that they would engage my mother in schooling, and particularly my fourth grade teacher, again, saying like, you need to learn English. You're in the United States now. And as I graduated sixth grade, I clearly remembered my name was being announced, right? It was, this is my teacher, right, who I spent a whole year with. This is how she pronounced my name, Maria Guadalupe Hernández. Oof. And so I was like, she ain't talking about me, because I'm like, at this point, you should know my name. Someone knows my name, right? So she announced that again. And then I said, oh, okay, you were actually calling me, right? You were actually calling me. And it was an interesting transition, more from the place of leaving El Salvador and now coming into a U.S. context, specifically one where we were undocumented, and then two, language was a context, but being brown for me was a context in a white space, and in the ways that I felt the othering. And what I kind of mapped out over the years was just, there's certain things that in elementary school that I think I've just blocked out, because there were moments of harm that happened that I just kind of blocked out. And I always thought, this is this idea around a better schooling moment, what quote unquote better education, but in relation to a neighborhood I existed in, where the schools that I would have gone to were not seen as quote unquote good schools. So early on, this idea of what an opportunity would look like, right, for this idea around opportunity, specifically for Black and brown children who lived in LA, South Central LA, that this was what a better opportunity was, that you'd go to white schools and be removed from your immediate community and be removed from your immediate neighborhood and schooling and family all at once. So then from there, I got bused further into the Valley to go to middle school and high school, as well as starting out in Sherman Oaks to now being further along what was that at that point, still the 101 freeway. And in that continuum, knowing evidently that I was different. I knew that very early on, that I was different in this space. Again,
Who would remind you that you were different? How were you reminded that you were different?
What
brought that
the daily experiences I would have between having moments where I know that who I was in terms of a Salvadorian female, Latina, a student, I was not reflected in any part of that curriculum. And I'm always fascinated by, because I remember this so well, in 10th grade, I was in honors English. and nothing in there kind of reflected who I was or who the few Black students that were in the class were in terms of who we were, in terms of our identity. Because I remember reading A Brave New World in that classroom, and all I thought was like, what does this have to do with me?
My life.
With my life at all. And the two critical points I do remember through my K-12 education experience was the only two Black teachers I had. One was my 7th grade teacher, Miss Gray, because throughout now 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, right, I've had only white teachers. And then here I find myself where like, oh, I have a teacher who somewhat looks like me, who I can connect to in terms of experiences around how I'm navigating this world of being other. And then my other teacher was in 12th grade. And what was so critical just around my 12th grade English teacher was like, she had us read Kaffir Boy. And I still have that. I still have the book. I literally still have that, the 12th grade book. It was that impactful because it really contextualized at that point apartheid in South Africa, right? So to be able to kind of hear stories that I can connect to, but it's just not Kaffir Boy, right? To be able to kind of connect around who I was in terms of my own identity, but again, right, to see a Black educator, I think, was so transformative. And the only other Latina
I was going to ask,
teacher
do you have
I
any
had,
Latina teachers?
he was my Spanish teacher.
Okay.
And that was really the extent
Your exposure.
of my exposure, right? So in many ways, it was just navigating simultaneously school, family, community. I get bused to the Valley, and my existence was among my other fellow students or friends who were Black and brown, who would go back home, right, back to our home community, and to be kind of removed on a day-to-day basis. And then we go home, right, to communities that validated us, and we could relate to, and who, to whatever degree, inculcated importance to us around that we mattered in our communities, and where we felt so much love and care for. And it doesn't lose, right, that I had caring teachers. It just means that to be able to have to go into a completely different space, 45 minutes to almost an hour away from your house, to quote unquote receive quote unquote a better education. And I think in the ways that many of our Black and brown families authentically thought that this is a great idea, right? So that our kids don't have to be around the local schools that were perceived as problematic or quote unquote not great schools.
Where so little is invested in those schools.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then not fully understanding, right, the intent, right, versus what the impact really is around ultimately ending up at that point was predominantly white schools, and the assumptions that go with that. If you go to a white school, it's a better school, but if you stay within your school that has predominantly Black and brown families existing in it, it's not such a good school.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you think your mother's, how she felt when she engaged with the schools, or how she was treated when she had contact with the schools? Do you have any sense of that?
I have a sense more around that. My mother would definitely be invested in my schooling. The ways that they engaged my mother, again, was a narrative that, to whatever degree, was marginalizing, because underlying an assumption, right? At that point, when I started elementary school, my mother actually started moving through high school to get her GED because she had an 8th grade education, right? And so the narrative and the underlying assumptions around, well, she doesn't speak English that well, the underlying assumptions of oh, okay, she's also an immigrant. Oh, she doesn't have a professional job. And not that they necessarily need her income, right? But they just have a stereotype around the potential lack of involvement of her in my schooling. And what I can say for sure is that there's in so many ways, anytime there was a parent-teacher conference, right, she was there. Anytime when it involved me and what I needed to do at home, whether it was reading, right, whether I had to complete homework. Even I remember like the scholastics book ordering form coming home, right, sitting home. She'd always say, okay, what book do you want? Which book should we get this time, right? I return it and I get my books. And even to the point, I think the underlying assumption, right, that not just my mother, right, but parents, caregivers of color who were sending their children out to the valley, right, because such a distance between LA and the valley, that they were not necessarily invested, right, in our education, which is far from the truth. It was just a distance, right, more than anything else, and it was just oftentimes our families having to work a couple of jobs, right, but the underlying assumptions that went with that, the lack of wanting to be interested. They don't care about their education because they're not showing up to the ways that we want them to show up. That still, for me, relied on a white model.
A white middle class model.
Exactly. But I clearly just remember this. It didn't need to be more. I think sometimes the assumption is that family engagement has to look a particular way. But there's other things that I can say that my mother would do at home as well. Like, okay, is your homework done? Okay, so take some time to do some reading. Okay, and even the level, I think, on her end, a sacrifice that she would make, right? Because she'd have to walk me to the bus stop early in the morning so I could get picked up and head to school, right? And moments where sometimes she would pick me up directly from school, as she herself was out in the valley working as well. But what is always conveyed to me was like, your education matters, and we're going to make sure that she's going to make sure that she did everything possible to make sure that I was going to move through an educational trajectory.
And here you are, with a very successful academic trajectory.